How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, no, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
The proceeding will start shortly. The proceeding will start shortly.
Order! Order. The questions to the Secretaries. Order. I think the two honourable gentlemen should know that we shouldn't be walking through when we have started proceedings. It's just about to start. Order. The questions to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Number 1, West Street.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 1 and 14 together. We have now left the EU with a good deal. Northern Ireland will remain part of the UK customs territory and will be able to participate in our free trade deals. The Prime Minister negotiated hard to ensure that measures are in place that reflect Northern Ireland's unique circumstances. There will be no hard border with Ireland. At the same time, the agreement completely safeguards Northern Ireland's integral place within the United Kingdom and the arrangements on rights and consent within the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
West Street.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister got the majority he asked for to deliver the Brexit that he wanted. But is it really possible for the Prime Minister to deliver on his promise that there would be no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind, not just between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but between the North of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland?
Very good.
Well, the protocol provides important protections in that respect, and of course we will be working through the Joint Committee and through the legislation which has been promised in New Decade, New Approach to deliver on those promises.
Alex Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government's assessment of the economic impact of the withdrawal agreement have little by way of forecasts as far as Northern Ireland is concerned. Does the Secretary of State agree that this shows the lack of regard the Government have actually shown to Northern Ireland throughout the Brexit process?
Hear, hear. The Government have put Northern Ireland actually at the centre of this process, and that is reflected in the nature of the protocol that is agreed as part of the withdrawal agreement and legislated for through the withdrawal agreement bill. But of course, the end result will depend on the free trade agreement negotiated between the UK and the EU, and it's too early at this stage to speculate on the details of that. Northern Ireland does enjoy special protections in this process as a result of the protocol.
Johnny Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister was very careful not to answer my honourable friend Trilford North as to whether there will be checks between goods travelling between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The First Minister is clear that there will be. The EU negotiator, Michel Barnier, is clear that there will be. Many people in industry and commerce in Northern Ireland believe there will be. Does the Minister agree that there will be checks, or does he say that there will not be checks between goods going from GB to Northern Ireland?
Well, I'd say to the right honourable gentleman, the Prime Minister has been clear, beyond our obligations under international law, there will be no changes for movements of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And when discussing the protocol with the EU, the UK will be ambitious on how flexible we can make this system. Northern Ireland remains part of the UK's customs territory.
Johnny Lloyd.
Mr Speaker, the Minister, of course, is right that the Prime Minister has been crystal clear. A very simple question for the Minister: is the Prime Minister right or wrong?
I'd say to the right honourable gentleman that the Prime Minister is always right.
Oh, in Patterson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. One of the ways of consolidating the benefits of leaving the EU would be to make Northern Ireland the most attractive part of the UK to trade. When I was the Secretary of State, we had an all-party campaign. It had support of all the business community, and thanks to tremendous efforts of my successor, the Honourable Lady for Chippy Barnett, the Executive now has the power to reduce corporation tax. Some members of the Executive are being gloomy about this. What steps is the Government taking to encourage the members of the Executive to take this amazing power to match the corporation tax in the Republic of Ireland?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very important point, and of course he speaks with considerable experience in this area. It is right that we agreed as part of previous agreements that the Executive has that power, and of course we stand ready should ministers from the Executive wish to use that power to engage with them, so long as they can show that the finances for the Northern Ireland Executive will be sustainable on the basis of any move in corporation tax.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will my honourable friend just confirm that the special status that Northern Ireland has as we leave the European Union, have left the European Union, means there's a bright new future for all the people in Northern Ireland, and the future should be embraced, not the doom and gloom from the party opposite?
My honourable friend makes a powerful point, and what I see when I visit businesses in Northern Ireland is actually a determination to deliver for the economy, to make sure that people in Northern Ireland enjoy the benefits, both of being part of a global and outward-looking UK, and of getting the best relationship with our European neighbours. That is an endeavour on which we must all now work together.
Jim Shannon.
Question number 2, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 2 and 7 together. The UK Government is providing the restored Executive with a £2 billion financial package that delivers for the people of Northern Ireland and supports delivery of the New Decade New Approach agreement. This financial commitment represents the biggest injection of new money in a Northern Ireland talks deal in well over a decade. £2 billion of extra investment gives the Executive the means to transform the lives of people in Northern Ireland for a generation.
Jim Shannon.
Thank the Secretary of State for his response. In January 2020, when making a statement about the New Decade New Approach deal, the Secretary of State told this House that the financial package was a good start. Now, I love a good start, Mr Speaker, but I also like a good progress. Can the Minister update this House what progress has been made in building on the good start to ensure investment in better mental health services, or dealing with the legacy of the past?
Well, I think indeed my honourable friend is right. There has been a very good start. We've seen multiple meetings here in Whitehall from joint ministers. We've had a JMC in Cardiff. We've seen yesterday both the First and Deputy First Ministers attending for the first time ever a recruitment drive by the PSNI. We've seen a very positive start, and I hope that continues.
Ben Bradley.
Thank you very much.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for his previous answer? Could he confirm for the House and for the communities of Northern Ireland that this is the most generous package of its kind that's ever been allocated to Northern Ireland and through a process like this?
Good question.
Indeed, my honourable friend is right. I think voters in Northern Ireland realise this is a good package. There will also be a budget coming up in March, and I'm sure that if the Executive prioritises its programme of government, there'll be a positive future for the whole of Northern Ireland.
Deirdre Bruck.
No, it's Kirsten. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State confirm that all of the welcome financial assistance being made available to the new Northern Ireland Executive will be subject to the Barnett formula? Yep. And can he also confirm what discussions he's had with the Secretary of State for Scotland on this matter?
Well, I think my honourable friend knows that this package is a unique package for Northern Ireland and is not subject to Barnett consequentials. I think the honourable lady also knows there is a very, very good Secretary of State for Scotland who enjoys working positively with her and her colleagues.
Erin Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is some discussion about what exactly £2 billion extra means amongst the parties in Northern Ireland, and it is important the government maintains their trust and with the people of Northern Ireland to honour the financial and economic commitments. But in the wake of the RHA scandal, it's also important that government ensures transparency and value for taxpayers' money. Can the Secretary of State tell us what investment is actually required to fund the Bengoa review, and what assessment has been made of savings from delivering an integrated education service?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. The answers are to be found with the Executive. It is up to the devolved government to look at how best to spend this package. It is up to the parties and the Executive to work through how it delivers on its side of the agreement, which is to transform both the health service and education. It's not for me to come up with those answers, but I look forward to hearing theirs.
Robert Larkin.
Number 3, sir.
The security situation in Northern Ireland remains severe.
Groupings as well.
Yeah. So if we could group these questions, which 3 questions, Mr. Speaker, 2, 3 and 7, and 3, 8 and 11. The security situation remains severe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the answer he's just given, can the Secretary of State advise the House what steps the government are taking to ensure a smooth transition and the continued security and peace in Northern Ireland when the withdrawal agreement transition period comes to an end on the 31st of December?
Well, I think there are very good discussions ongoing with the EU on security matters. There are very strong bonds with the Irish government, and I remain confident that the security situation that I've just described can be well managed with the current relationships that we have and within the remit of the transition agreement.
Demi Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend join me in condemning the continuing presence of dissident organisations in Northern Ireland, and would he say that there is no place in our society for those who peddle hate and division?
No, I agree with my honourable friend. We have to condemn the ongoing activities of dissident Republicans. I pay tribute to the police and to our security services for all of the work they do to make sure that Northern Ireland remains safe.
Ranald Jobodina.
But what about those who have been responsible for security in years gone by? When will this government put an end to the vexatious claims against our brave armed forces?
As I mentioned earlier, my honourable friend, to answer my honourable friend's question, we have said, and the Prime Minister couldn't be clearer, we will end vexatious claims, both for police and for armed forces, and we look forward to bringing forward legislation in that regard in due course.
Impatient.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Secretary of State has just said, that he's going to end vexatious complaints for police officers. In light of that, will the Secretary of State now commit to meet with Mark Lindsay, the Chairman of the Northern Ireland Police Federation, and with officers from the Retired Police Officers Association, so as they can put to him their grave concerns about non-criminal charges that have been suggested should be levelled at former serving brave police officers in Ulster?
Of course, meet with the individuals my right honourable friends mentioned as soon as possible.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will know that the Stormont House Agreement is the process agreed by all parties after consultation with victims on how to address the legacy of the Trust troubles on the basis of truth and justice and reconciliation. Does he agree that this is the settled process, and is he confident that the Government will stick to this process and to the principle that everybody is equal before the law?
I'm confident that we can deliver on the Government's priority of ending vexatious claims for our armed forces and for the police, but also look forward to working with all parties in Northern Ireland to develop a consensus on how we move forward on the Stormont House Agreement.
Conor McGinn.
Mr. Speaker, will he join me in welcoming the support from political parties and community organisations like the GAA for the new PSNI recruitment campaign? Will he encourage young nationalists to join the police, pursue a noble career and profession? And will he join me in commending the work of PSNI officers and Garda Síochána and indeed police across the whole of these islands?
It was such a positive event yesterday when we saw the First Minister and Deputy First Minister attending that recruitment drive. I would encourage all young women and men in Northern Ireland who are interested in the police service to join, from whatever background they come from.
Lawrence Robertson.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Northern Ireland is a leading destination for inward investment, with employment at a record high and unemployment at a record low. However, there is more to be done to unleash Northern Ireland's economic potential. The UK Government is providing significant funding to Northern Ireland, including through £1 billion Barnet-based investment guarantee and £562 million for city and growth deals covering the whole of Northern Ireland.
Russell Robertson.
Thank the Minister for that response, as well as discussing corporation tax, which he should when he discusses these matters with the Executive. Will he also consider the levels of VAT on tourism and also air passenger duty with the Executive, because I understand both have been reduced in the Republic of Ireland?
My honourable friend raises some important points. The tourism potential of Northern Ireland is enormous, and I can confirm to him that, as previously committed, this Government is reviewing the devolution of APD, and that review is ongoing.
Sir Geoffrey Dawes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We welcome the success of InvestNI and others in attracting investment to Northern Ireland. But it is essential we continue to have unfettered access to our biggest market, which is Great Britain, and that economic growth is dependent upon that, and we need the Government to honour the commitments they've made to ensure that we continue to have that access in both directions.
I absolutely recognise the importance of the issues the right honourable gentleman is raising. This is something that we will honour. We've committed through New Decade, New Approach to specific legislation on this issue, and look forward to working with him and with the other parties on delivering that.
Sir Geoffrey Dawes.
Will the Minister indicate the timescale within which the Government hope to bring forward those legislative measures? Because it's essential that business has the certainty that they need at this time to take investment decisions.
Well, as you will know, the commitment is to have this legislation in place by the end of this year. But of course, there will have to be discussions through the usual channels as to the precise timing of that.
All right. Simon Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the House for returning me to chair the Select Committee? A strong economy requires access to a skilled, motivated workforce. Clearly, we have to ensure that the skills base in Northern Ireland is supported and grows. But can my honourable friend assure me that the voice and needs of the Northern Irish economy will be heard loudly in the Home Office as we finesse our immigration policies moving forward?
My honourable friend, let me congratulate him on his re-election as chair of the Select Committee. He makes a very important point, and it's something that I have heard loud and clear from Northern Irish businesses. I think they welcome some of the indications coming from the MAC report, and of course we will ensure, as a Northern Ireland office, that the concerns and interests of Northern Ireland businesses are communicated across government, including to the Home Office.
Adelaide.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is right to say that the
potential for the Northern Ireland economy is enormous, and there is no doubt that restoration of the executive will unlock great amounts of that potential. But could he also say what benefits Northern Ireland economy receives from being part of the 5th largest economy in the world as being part of the United Kingdom?
Well, my right honourable friend speaks with enormous knowledge of this area, and she is absolutely right. Northern Ireland's economy benefits enormously from its membership of the United Kingdom, and there will be new opportunities for Northern Ireland as we trade more globally and strike new free trade deals around the world.
Question 5, Mr. Speaker.
Following the restoration of the institutions, Mr. Speaker, I have of course been in frequent contact with the Chancellor and other government colleagues to discuss the New Decade New Approach agreement. This agreement is, as we heard earlier, supported by a generous financial package of £2 billion and also comes with some strings attached, reform required in health, in education and justice. The new Finance Minister has been already across to London to meet with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury and myself.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The document you've referred to, the Secretary of State's referred to, New Decade, New Approach, was not created by the 5 parties in Northern Ireland, but by the UK and Irish governments. It set expectations high amongst the public in Northern Ireland. Will the government commit to fully funding and generously funding this agreement?
Well, as the Honourable Lady knows, this agreement has already delivered an end to the nurses' strike in Northern Ireland. But I have to say to her, having sat through hours of negotiation and discussion, it was always clear that the parties had to prioritise what they wanted from government. They are about to do that, and I look forward to hearing their plans in due course.
Rob Roberts.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 6 and 15 together. The New Decade New Approach deal has restored decision-making to locally accountable representatives in Northern Ireland and guarantees the Good Friday Agreement. It has ended 3 years of stasis at Stormont and is already having a beneficial effect on Northern Ireland citizens.
Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this Conservative government has demonstrated their commitment to strong devolved government and funding for all of our nations within this United Kingdom?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We've delivered in Northern Ireland, we've delivered in Scotland, we're delivering in Wales, and we're delivering on our commitments to the Union.
John Lamont.
Over the last few years, this House has made a number of important decisions on very important devolved areas of government in Northern Ireland. Does the Minister agree with me that locally elected politicians in Northern Ireland are best placed to be making those local decisions?
My honourable friend is absolutely correct. Ensuring that the Good Friday institutions are retained and enhanced was an absolute priority of the UK government, and Northern Ireland is best served by the power sharing agreement that is in place.
Gavin. Thank you. Secretary of State, to ensure that we have a stable government, and that needs confidence within the community. In light of recent media associated with the death and horrific murder of Paul Quinn, a minister from Northern Ireland was mentioned within that programme. Any information that minister, Mr Conor Murphy, has relating to this incident, he should make known to both the PSNI and the Garda.
I agree with my honourable friend. I condemn wholeheartedly that horrendous murder. As with any crime, anyone with information with regard to that crime should come forward immediately.
Stephen Furry.
Can the Secretary of State clarify his earlier answer in relation to the Stormont House agreement? Because he very obviously did not reference that agreement and talked in generalities. This was a commitment made recently in the New Decade Approach and existing government policy back in 2015. Is it still government policy to fully deliver Stormont House?
What I've said is we're going to deliver on the commitment of ending vexatious claims on our armed forces and on our police officers. And I've also said I will discuss with all Northern Ireland parties how we deliver on all aspects of the New Decade New Approach document.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just following on that answer, can he confirm that the specific assurances given on Armistice Day last year about the ending of repeat investigations in the absence of compelling new evidence is entirely compatible with the restoration of devolved government and all that entails?
Well, first of all, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for all of his work on this area, and I was reading his Select Committee report from 2018 at the weekend again. I absolutely confirm that we can deliver on the Prime Minister and this government's priority of ending vexatious claims on our armed forces and on the police, and we can also deliver for victims and for survivors in Northern Ireland.
Wendy Chamberlain.
For 9, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The deal makes clear that Northern Ireland is in and remains part of the UK customs territory. It allows the UK to ensure unfettered market access for goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. The arrangements we introduce will reflect this.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister talks about unfettered access on goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. But according to a Treasury document leaked during the election campaign, firms will have to complete exit summary declarations at a minimum. So I ask him again, will goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain have to complete customs declarations? And if I ask that again at a future session, will he give the same answer?
I'd say to the Honourable Lady, it's absolutely clear that goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, that is within the control of the UK government, and we have made clear commitments with regard to ensuring that unfettered access to the whole of the UK internal market.
Alex Carmichael.
Number 10, sir.
The deal implementing domestic law through the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020 means we have now left the EU as one united kingdom. The protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland guarantees Northern Ireland's integral place in the UK, and this government will never be neutral in expressing our support for the Union and our steadfast belief that Northern Ireland's best interests are served within a strong united kingdom.
Alistair Carmichael.
The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster tells us yesterday that we do not need a deal with the European Union. If he's right, what will that mean for the future of Northern Ireland and the Union?
Well, I think the point the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster was making is that we already have a deal with the European Union. We have left the European Union with a deal, and I think that's good news for Northern Ireland and the whole of the United Kingdom.
Karen McCarthy.
Question 12, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as I stated earlier, the deal makes crystal clear that Northern Ireland is in and remains part of the UK's customs territory. It allows the UK to ensure unfettered market access for goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. The arrangements we introduce will reflect this. As Great Britain and Northern Ireland are in the same customs territory, no tariffs will be due on goods coming from Great Britain and staying in Northern Ireland.
Karen McCarthy.
The European Commission released documents showing that EU import formalities, such as customs declarations, would end up taking place in Belfast on goods imported from the EU. I see the Minister is struggling to hear what I'm saying. Can I just say, does he not think that the best way of actually ensuring that there's no barriers on trade would be to remain in a customs union?
As the Honourable Lady will recognise, there are specific arrangements in the protocol which protect Northern Ireland's position with regards to trade both with Ireland and with the United Kingdom. It is in the UK's gift, and we will deliver on our commitments to ensure Northern Ireland has unfettered access to the whole of the UK internal market.
Chris Stevens.
Number 13, sir.
Here we go again from the SNP, but here we go again with the answer. As there has been no increase in UK government departmental spending in England, there are therefore no Barnett consequentials. Like previous Northern Ireland support packages, Mr. Speaker, this funding addresses unique challenges, as was the case with city deals and support for farmers in both Scotland and Wales.
Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We welcome the return of the new executive and new monies for Northern Ireland, but given the Prime Minister's stated previous opposition, would the Secretary of State for the record confirm if his government still intends to abide by the Barnett formula?
I can confirm we absolutely plan to abide by the Barnett formula, and that's why, as part of this government's commitments, we're levelling up across the nations of the United Kingdom.
Colonel Lockhart.
I thank the Secretary of State for his answer. He will know that farming and fisheries are an important part of our local economy, and you mentioned the Barnett consequentials towards farmers. Can you give specific assurances that farmers and fishermen will be looked after now that we have left the EU?
I can confirm that we will look after everybody after we leave the EU, but I'm also reticent, sitting so close to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, on making any commitments about the forthcoming budget.
Before we start Prime Minister's questions, I'd just like to draw the attention to the House to the fact that for the first time the House of Commons is starting a trial scheme to provide British Sign Language interpretation of PMQs online. A signed version of the session is available live on the Parliament Live TV. Can I just say that everyone deserves to be able to follow what is such a key moment in the parliamentary week, and I'm clear that committed to our proceedings accessible and clear as possible. I really want to thank everyone who has worked very hard to make this happen. Question 1, Dr. Jamie Walsh.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will want to pay tribute to the police and all of the emergency services for their brave response to the terrorist incident in Streatham on Sunday. This appalling incident makes plain the case for immediate action, and we will shortly introduce emergency legislation to make sure that we do everything to protect the public. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Jeremy Wallace.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my constituents in Bridgend, may I warmly congratulate the Prime Minister for delivering on the promise made to the British people that we will leave the European Union. Will he reassure my constituents that now that we are taking back control of our money, our borders and our laws, that every effort will be made to bring jobs and investment to areas such as Bridgend that feel left behind?
Mr. Speaker, I can give him that assurance, and I can tell him that with better education, better infrastructure and high technology, we will unite and level up this country and deliver, as he is doing, for the people of Bridgend.
Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, we were all appalled by the terror attack in Streatham on Sunday, and I want to join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the bravery and dedication of the police, security services and all the other emergency response staff in the way in which they dealt with what was a terrifying and terrible situation. Last Friday, this country left the European Union. Britain's place in the world is at a crossroads, and whilst there are different views across this country, we will be holding this government to account as the negotiations begin. But my hope is that we now truly come together to shape our common future and build an internationalist, diverse and outward-looking country. Indeed, we'll get an opportunity to do that when Britain hosts the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, later this year. Despite the fact that we are the 11th hour to save the planet, the former Tory minister and now ex-president of COP26, Claire O'Neill, said, and I quote, "There has been a huge lack of leadership and engagement from this government." What on earth did she mean?
Mr. Speaker, I think if you look at what this government is achieving and already has achieved on climate change, it is quite phenomenal. And he will know, Mr. Speaker, that last year was the first year on record that renewables produced more of the energy of this country than fossil fuels. He will know that since this government came to power, in 2010, 99% of all the solar panels that have achieved that miracle were installed under this government. We are delivering for the people of this country. We are reducing greenhouse gas. All he would produce, I'm afraid, is a load of hot air.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is the government's own figures show that it's missing the carbon budget, let alone by 2050. It will be 2099 before this country meets net zero. And we discovered this morning that two former Conservative leaders have also turned down the job formerly done by his minister. Maybe it could be third time lucky. Perhaps we could make a joint approach to the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. Perhaps he would like to take on that job. He's over here and in the chamber all ready for it. His own former Tory minister said we should have clear actions, an agreed plan and a roadmap for the year of action. But we do not. So why is the Prime Minister failing so spectacularly to measure up to the scale of the climate crisis that this country and indeed this planet is facing?
Mr. Speaker, this is beyond satire. This government. This is the first country, the first major economy in the world to have set a target of carbon neutral by 2050. It's an absolutely fantastic thing. We are leading the world in our ambitions, and we will have a wonderful summit in Glasgow, one of the most fantastic cities in our country, at the end of the year.
Mr. Speaker, this country isn't meeting its target, and it isn't due to meet its target, and I think the Prime Minister should recognise that. Even the Paris targets are not enough. The UN says we have just a decade to change course if we want to avert a climate catastrophe. So let's look at something else his ex-minister said. The Prime Minister promised to lead from the front and guaranteed there would be money and people. But these promises are not close to being met. What on earth could she have been talking about?
Mr. Speaker, as so often, I'm not entirely sure what the right honourable gentleman is talking about, because if you look at what this government has actually delivered, if you look at what our Conservative policies of backing green tech, of backing innovation, of supporting a dynamic market economy, which is the solution to these problems, we have cut CO2 emissions in this country since 2010 on 1990 levels by 42%. 42%. That is an astonishing achievement, and at the same time, the economy has grown by 73%, thanks to free market, dynamic, one nation conservatism. That is our approach. What's his?
His former minister said, my advice to... Well, you might not like it, but I'm going to read it. My advice to anyone to whom the Prime Minister is making promises, whether it's voters, world leaders, ministers, employees or family members, is get it in writing, get a lawyer to look at it and make sure the money's in the bank. Not my words, hers. The Prime Minister's failure in government means this country won't meet its net zero target until 2099. This government has banned offshore wind, and his government is funding billions on fossil fuel projects abroad. Is this what his minister means by the absence of leadership?
Mr. Speaker, I think the grotesque failure of the Leader of the Opposition to understand what is happening in this country's economy, let alone in the fight against climate change, is quite mind-boggling. I can inform him today that this country is leading in not just producing the technology to generate offshore wind, but the northeast of this country leads the world in producing and designing those fantastic turbines. And it's because of that technological innovation that we are able massively to expand our renewables. And I can tell him, I think he may know this, that in 1990 this country was 70% dependent on coal power. We are now today, and by the way, he'd want to reopen the coal mines. Today we are down to 3%, Mr. Speaker, and by 2024 it will be zero. That's our plan. What's his?
It was the Labour Party that proposed the climate change emergency motion to this House on May the 1st. And the Prime Minister is quoting things that happened in 1990 and afterwards. During that time, of course, he was a climate sceptic who didn't say anything about this at all. Poor leadership is nothing new to this Prime Minister. When he was Foreign Secretary, he cut the number of climate attachés across the world by 60% in our embassies, and reportedly said, "You're not going to spill this out to the media, are you?" to his staff. Considering his monumental failure in advance of COP26, isn't it really just a continuation of his climate change denial statements that he was regularly making up until 2015?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is talking absolute nonsense. This government is delivering a fantastic agenda in tackling climate change. We lead the world in going for a zero-carbon approach. His own approach is utterly utterly unclear and has indeed been condemned by the GMB as a disaster for the UK economy. That would force people to he would confiscate people's cars and prevent them from having foreign holidays. We have a plan that will allow the UK economy to continue to grow, that will create jobs and tackle climate change.
Jeremy Corbyn. I really do admire the Prime Minister's very vivid imagination. But unfortunately, his vivid imagination seems to have taken over from his memory, because he might recall saying that climate change is a primitive fear without foundation. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh said, "Any consequence of failure to deliver a climate action plan must fall equally on every country. The cost of our inaction is devastating to every living person." But our Prime Minister is failing on the biggest stage on the most important issue of our time. And now his former minister has described preparations in Whitehall as Whitehall not tying infighting and obfuscation, petty political squabbles and black ops briefings. No wonder the Prime Minister is shutting newspapers out of number 10, because he doesn't like the briefings. When will he face up to the climate emergency and take the action necessary to turn Glasgow into the turning point when this world will stop the levels of pollution and climate change we're having and go forward to a sustainable future, because his government's policies simply don't take us there.
Mr. Speaker, this government is showing world leadership in tackling climate change. We're going to have a fantastic summit at Glasgow, and I look forward very much to it. Now, Mr. Speaker, he mentions the media. They did an inquest finally about what happened in the general election, and they discovered in the Labour Party that it wasn't the leadership that was at fault. It wasn't Brexit. It was the media. They blame the media for what happened. Mr. Speaker, I don't blame them. I am a journalist. I love journalism, and I think the people of this country, Mr. Speaker, don't blame the media. They can see the media do their best to represent the reality. And the reality is this is a government that is getting on with delivering 40 new hospitals, 20,000 more police, tackling climate change, £30,000 starting salaries for every teacher in the country. It's not about the presentation of the facts, Mr. Speaker. It's about the reality. And he can't cope with the reality.
For Broxtowe, I'm absolutely delighted that funding is starting to flow to rebuild hospitals, such as the £5 million seed funding going to Nottingham University Hospital's NHS Trust. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this Conservative government is committed to fulfilling its manifesto pledges and will deliver for the NHS?
Mr. Speaker, I do agree passionately with my honourable friend, and I congratulate him on all he's done to campaign for the redevelopment of Queen's Medical Centre and Nottingham City Hospital, and of course I'm proud that that money is now flowing through to those wonderful projects.
Ian Blackfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I add my grateful thanks to the police and emergency services that had to react to the dreadful terrorist incident in Streatham. Mr. Speaker, in the first few days of Brexit Britain, this Prime Minister has sacked an official, taken an isolationist approach to trade and banned the press from a Downing Street briefing. Is he intentionally trying to impersonate Donald Trump?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think anybody listening to my speech, I think it was on Monday, could have mistaken it for anything but the most passionate, internationalist, globalist, open, outward-looking approach. There is only one party in this country that has nationalist in their name, Mr. Speaker. That's them. They would break up the most successful political partnership of the last 300 years. He and his party should concentrate on the day job and doing a better job for the people of Scotland.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister doesn't even know the name of our party. The Prime Minister is on a dangerous trajectory. Is it any wonder that poll after poll shows majority support for Scottish independence. Mr. Speaker, our former US ambassador has made clear the threat of a Tory-Trump trade deal, warning that drug prices could soar. This would see increased pressure on our frontline services. It is clearer than ever that this government, this Prime Minister, is a threat to our NHS. Mr. Speaker, this afternoon the SNP will present our NHS protection bill to remove the very real threat of Tory privatisation. Will the Prime Minister commit right now to supporting our legislation?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's very odd that he should denounce this country's wish to have trade deals around the world, when, as I understand it, their proposal is to try to rejoin the European Union, to have a different currency whose name they have yet to identify. Perhaps they could elucidate the House, to have a border at Berwick, and what just after this country has taken back control of its outstanding marine wealth, to hand it back to Brussels. That's their policy. I really think, Mr. Speaker, they should concentrate on doing a better job for the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A strong society needs strong families, as our manifesto rightly said. And it went on to say that we will champion family hubs to serve vulnerable families. Will the Prime Minister prioritise family hubs and ensure that family hubs are linked to our early years strategy, to the Troubled Families programme and to children's services reform?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend. That's why we've given another £165 million to extend the Troubled Families programme this year.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the past 10 years, violent crime has risen 152% across the towns of Warwickshire. In the past 2 weeks in my constituency, 2 people have been killed in 2 separate events, and others remain seriously ill or injured. The government has promised to reinstate 20,000 police officers, but isn't it the simple truth that it is now our residents, through hikes in council tax of 12% last year, 6% this year, that are picking up the whole bill for the old bill, and that it's the party opposite is no longer the party of law and order, but the party of fear and disorder?
Mr. Speaker, to be fair to the honourable gentleman, he's making an important point about violent crime. I share his anger, and that's why we're putting 20,000 more police on the streets of our country. And that's above all why we are now tackling the county lines drugs gangs that are behind so much of this rise in violent crime. We will get that crime down.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is conscious of the very widespread concern in this House about the plans to involve Huawei in 5G networks, concern that will only be increased by the news this week that France is building a new 5G network without the involvement of Huawei, following the lead of Australia. If they can do it, we could do it. Can my right honourable friend confirm that it's the... Can he confirm that he wants to reduce Huawei's involvement over time, and can he give a timescale as to when that involvement will hit zero?
Well, he's certainly right, Mr. Speaker, that we are going to be reducing the involvement of Huawei below the 35% market cap, but he's also right in his general vision, which is one I entirely share. What has happened is, I'm afraid, a failure of like-minded countries to produce an alternative to the 5G network, except that provided by high-risk vendors. And that is why we are now doubling the science budget, and we will be working with some of the countries that he mentions in order to produce exactly that diversification in the market.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In November last year, the Personal Independence Payment Assessment Centre in my constituency was moved to Hill. No notice has ever been given of this change. The next bus from Carnarvon to Hill takes 1 hour 44 minutes. Or in a case in point in my right honourable friend's constituency, the bus from Barmouth to Hill takes 5 hours 15 minutes. Mr. Speaker, this is the reality in the Prime Minister's soar away global Britain. Will he instruct his minister to remedy this matter immediately?
Well, actually, I thank the honourable gentleman for the point he raises. I think that we do need to improve our bus services across the whole country, and that's why we're investing another £220 million immediately into improving bus services. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has many more such investments in the pipeline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes we are the train, sometimes we are the track, and just last week we've taken control back. And does the Prime Minister agree with me that now is the time for us to be the track for a Metrolink between Manchester and Bolton?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we've given the combined, thanks partly to his urgings, to his campaign. We have given the combined mayoral authority in Bolton £300 million under the Transforming Cities deal, plus a share of the £4.2 billion local public transport fund. We've given them the tools. Let's hope that they follow his urgings and build the Metrolink that he wants.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday I visited a school in my constituency, and in 2020 the state of the school buildings was Dickensian. Leaking roofs, rusty shower rooms, mouldy changing areas. When will this government understand that the cost of education is high, but it's a worthy investment in the future of our schools? Whether a child is a whiz kid, whether a child is needy, every child deserves to be at school in an excellent and inspiring school building.
Mr. Speaker, that is exactly why this government is investing £14 billion, a record £14 billion more in education, raising funding for primary schools to £4,000 per head and £5,000 for every secondary school in the country. And we can only do that, Mr. Speaker, because we are running a strong and dynamic market economy, and that is what we're going to do.
Dempson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To help genuinely spread opportunity across our country, can I encourage my right honourable friend to have a pre-budget chat with his Chancellor about extending the government's welcome plans to reduce national insurance contributions for employers of ex-service personnel to other groups who find it difficult to get a good job, including care leavers, ex-offenders, those with a disability and the long-term unemployed?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank him and his family for everything that they do to encourage ex-offenders into work. I will indeed take up that suggestion with my right honourable friend, the Chancellor. And we cut taxes on working people. We cut national insurance, Mr. Speaker. They would hike taxes and keep people in welfare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been 2 years since the Windrush scandal exposed the wrongful detention and deportation of Commonwealth citizens. While we wait for the much-delayed publication of the Lessons Learned Review, the government plans to deport 50 people to Jamaica by charter flight next week. Will the Prime Minister immediately suspend the flight until the Lessons Learned Review is published and the recommendations implemented?
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House will understand that the people of this country will think it right to send back foreign national offenders.
Suella Balmerman.
Terrorist incident last week reminds us that the rule of law remains a fundamental foundation of our democratic constitution. But the explosion of judicial review and judicial activism have led to a censoriousness and litigiousness in our society and distorted questions which ought to remain exclusively political. How will my right honourable friend ensure that Parliament remains the sovereign and legitimate source of law as we take back control?
Well, my honourable friend is a distinguished lawyer, and she is right to stick up for the immense value of our legal system. We must protect judicial review. It's a vital part of our system, but we should also ensure that it is not abused, Mr. Speaker, to conduct politics by other means or to create needless delay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For many years, Bedford has been promised a new inpatient mental health facility, especially since provision at Bellowing was closed in 2017. Yet patients are still travelling 20 miles to access services. Will the Prime Minister explain how this demonstrates the parity of esteem in mental health care that his party promised in 2012?
Mr. Speaker, we're putting record investment into the NHS, 33.9 billion, and a total of 12 billion are now going into mental health care. That is a record sum.
David.
I'd like to follow on my right honourable friend for Ashford's question on Huawei. The Australian agencies analysed the involvement of any element of Huawei in their 5G system and determined that any involvement would lead to a major risk of both sabotage and espionage. Can he give an undertaking that this country will lead the Five Eyes and NATO to create an alternative to Huawei in the next 2 years?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. We, of course, will do nothing to endanger either our critical national security infrastructure or to prejudice cooperation with Five Eyes partners, as he's rightly suggested. And we will work to ensure that high-risk vendors cannot dominate our market.
Alex Davis, sure.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that under his government there has been a mass shortage of consultants across the UK, leading to a strain on our A&E services. How is he going to make sure, especially now that we have left the EU, that consultants from overseas are encouraged to apply for NHS visas to work in hospitals across the UK?
Mr. Speaker, of course we've instituted NHS visas in order to attract talent from around the world, but I would remind her that I think she speaks for a Welsh seat, that is a devolved matter for the Welsh Labour government.
The Prime Minister has rightly put keeping our country safe and the NHS at the heart of this government's plans. Will he support my campaign for 2 new GP surgeries in my beautiful market towns of Oakham and Melton? And can I remind him that he's always welcome if he's in search of a pork pie, Rutland Bitter or Stilton?
That was rude. I think that was just... Mr. Speaker, the short answer is yes and yes.
Lily Raymond.
Last week it was revealed that my constituent Errol Graham starved to death just months after the DUP stopped his benefits. His emaciated body was only discovered when bailiffs broke down his front door to evict him. The first priority of government is to keep its citizens safe. How many more vulnerable benefit claimants will have to die before his government starts to value their lives?
Mr. Speaker, this is a tragic case, and she is right to raise it. We've allocated 36 million to improve safeguarding and decision-making in cases like this, including the creation of a new independent serious case panel so that we can scrutinise and learn lessons from tragic cases like this, as well as improving guidance for staff involved.
Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join with me and on behalf of the whole House extend our sympathy and best wishes to those who were injured in the Streatham attack last week? May I welcome his intention to legislate as a consequence of this attack? And will he agree that Her Majesty's government really has now no option but to legislate to try and contain the threat of ex-terrorist offenders where they still pose a threat to our country?
Yes, I think, Mr. Speaker, that my right honourable friend is entirely right, and I think that most of the people in this country would agree that the system of automatic early release of terrorist offenders has run out of road, and it's time to find a way, as we are, to make sure that they are properly scrutinised by a parole board or by an equivalent.
Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to the tireless work of my predecessor, the late great Paul Flynn, and my honourable friend, the member for Gower, and the families of children with intractable epilepsy, medical cannabis is now legal in the UK. So can the Prime Minister answer calls from the families of very sick children who need medical cannabis when this medicine will actually be available in the NHS? And will he come to Portcullis House with me after this session to meet these families and to personally assure them that he will do all he can to help?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was this government and my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, who did legalise medicinal cannabis, and I can undertake that he will certainly be happy to meet your constituents this afternoon.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Buses are a vital lifeline for residents in Rother Valley, but too often first buses are letting down the people of South Yorkshire. Will the Prime Minister confirm that this government fully backs buses as an essential way not only to connect our villages, towns and cities across the north, but also to unlock the potential of Rother Valley and South Yorkshire?
Mr. Speaker, this government as a whole is absolutely passionate about buses, and I can assure him that we are massively going to improve our bus network in the Rother Valley above all, and I thank him for the lobbying that he is doing.
Owen Thompson. Mr. Speaker, we know the Prime Minister has form in ducking democratic scrutiny at every opportunity, and his party is no stranger to receiving Russian donations. But his repeated refusal to publish the report into Russian interference in UK democracy is unjustifiable and unacceptable. Can the Prime Minister tell us clearly, without bluff and bluster, when the report into Russian interference will be published, why it has been delayed so long, and when will he reconvene the Intelligence and Security Committee?
Mr. Speaker, the report will of course be published, as he knows full when the Intelligence and Security Committee is reconstituted, and I think he's likely to be his conspiratorial frame of mind is likely to be thoroughly disappointed by the results.
Dean Russell.
Mr. Speaker, commuters in Watford are fed up with poor rail services, making them late for work in the morning and late at home at night to see their families. Will the Prime Minister agree with me that even new rail franchises that don't deliver cannot assume that they will keep their contract if they don't sort out the issues as soon as possible?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're putting £48 billion into improving our railways as part of the infrastructure revolution. But never forget, Mr. Speaker, that lot would renationalise the railways, and when the railways were nationalised, a quarter of railway users deserted the network. After privatisation, rail use doubled, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, last week we lost a political giant in Seamus Mallon. He was an outstanding parliamentarian and a seeker of justice for everyone. One injustice that burned with him until his dying day was the murder of Paul Quinn. Paul was beaten to death by an IRA gang in 2007. They broke every single bone in his body, so much so that his mother couldn't place rosary beads in his hands in his coffin. In the aftermath of that, the now Finance Minister Conor Murphy said that Paul was linked to criminality. That was a lie. Will the Prime Minister agree with me that that lie, and that Conor Murphy should retract that lie, publicly apologise and give any information he has to the PSNI about Paul's murder?
Mr. Speaker, well, I hear the honourable gentleman, and I think the whole House will hear the passion with which he spoke about that injustice, and I can tell him that we will implement the Stormont House Agreement in such a way as to provide certainty for veterans and, of course, justice for victims as well.
We now come to point of order, John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Home Office press team told journalists that everybody on the deportation flight to Jamaica are serious criminals. Mr. Speaker, this seems not to be true. I've got a constituent of mine, as the Honourable Member of Nottingham East has said, they haven't even had the report. And I've got the wife of a constituent of mine who has said that he is due to be deported in just 6 days' time. He was convicted under the now unlawful joint enterprise rule. He was released after 2 months, and his wife feels that this stress is going to kill her husband because he has a heart problem. Mr. Speaker, how can I get the Home Secretary to take this seriously and be truthful about the people who are on the flight, the deportation flight, and if we can halt this flight until we establish the true facts of the situation?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for giving me notice of her question and the point of order she's raised? What I would say is, as she knows, it's not a point of order for me personally. But of course I think they all have their sympathy in which what she's said, and I'm sure the front bench opposite the government front bench has heard what's said, and I'm sure that somebody will be looking into the matter as a matter of urgency. Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister's questions on the 22nd of January, responding to a question from the Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister said that, and I quote, "Universal credit has in fact succeeded in getting 200,000 people into jobs." Correspondence that I received yesterday from Sir David Norgrove, the Chair of the UK Statistics Authority, a copy of which has now been published on its website, has shown that the Prime Minister's claim was not correct. The 200,000 figure that the Prime Minister referred to represents the Department for Work and Pensions estimate of the predicted impact on employment once universal credit is rolled out, rather than the effect so far. Mr. Speaker, please could you advise on how the Prime Minister could set the record straight?
Can I just say I thank the honourable member for giving me notice of her intention to raise this matter. What I would say is it's not a matter for the Chair to police the accuracy of statements in the Chamber. So what I would say is, quite rightly, you've raised it, it has now been put on the record, and your opinion is now there, and I'm sure there are other ways in case you're not happy with the error that's made. But thank you. Right, I'm now coming to presentation of bills. I want to start off with presentation. Mike Ainsbury.
Education guidance about costs of school uniforms bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 13th of March. Sir.
Friday the 13th of March. Darren Jones.
Forensic Science Regulator and Biometric Strategy Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 24th of April.
Friday the 24th of April. Anna McMorland.
Cooperative and Community Benefit Society's Environmentally Sustainable Investment Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 27th of March.
Friday the 27th of March. Laura Trott.
Botulinum Toxin and Cosmetic Fillers Children Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 15th of May.
Friday the 15th of May. Chris Loder.
Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 12th of June, sir.
Friday the 12th of June. Paula Barker.
National Minimum Wage Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 26th of June, sir.
Friday the 26th of June. Philip Dunn.
Sewage Inland Waters Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 10th of July.
Friday the 10th of July, and no one blocked, I understand. We now come to Mark. Oh, I got Mark Francois. No, sorry. Charles Walker on behalf of Cheryl Gillen. Sir Charles Walker, may I say?
Yeah. Prison Substance Testing Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 15th of May, sir.
Friday the 15th of May. Mr. Mark Francois.
Controlled Roadworks Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 12th of June.
Friday the 12th of June. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Mental Health Admissions Data Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 30th of October.
Friday the 30th of October. It's a long wait, isn't it? Hold on. Slow burn, very much so. Bimafalome.
British Library Board Power to Borrow Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 13th of March, sir.
Friday the 13th of March. Well done. We now come to Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Public Interest Disclosure Protection Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 24th of April, Mr.
Friday the 24th of April. Peter Grant.
Trade Agreements Exclusion of National Health Services Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 26th of June, Mr. Speaker.
Friday the 26th of June. Alex Cunningham.
What number are you?
Unpaid Work Experience Prohibition Number 2 Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 27th of March.
Friday the 27th of March. We're going to have a busy time ahead.
The deal. Loud wicked voice.
On behalf of Liz Twist, Mary Kelly. No,
Mary Kelly Ford.
hang on a minute. Yes, Liz Twist on call Mary Kelly. Thank you, Liz.
Education, Training, Welfare of Children Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 13th of March.
Friday the 13th of March. Thanks. Andrew Mitchell.
Yay. Registers of births and deaths bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 15th of May.
Friday the 15th of May. Thanks, Andrew. Bill Wiggin.
Double yay. Meat grading and labelling bill.
Should declare an interest. Second reading what day?
Friday the 29th of January 2021.
Friday the 29th of January 2021. Kettles. Okay.
NHS 111 Service Training and Clinical Oversight Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 10th of July, Mr. Speaker.
Friday the 10th of July. Thanks, Kate. Simon Phelps.
Third sector organisations impact and support bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday 11th of September.
Friday the 11th of September. So we're sitting. And last certainly but not least, Patrick Grady on behalf of Carol Monaghan.
Asylum seekers permission to work bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 27th of November.
Friday the 27th of November. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We now come to the business of the day. We come to the first opposition day motion on local government finance. Just let everyone just go a second. Okay. I now call Andrew Gwynn to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with permission of the House...
Just to let you know, I had selected the amendment in the name of the Prime Minister. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Speaker. And with permission of the House, I beg to move the opposition motion in the name of the Leader of the Opposition, myself and my right honourable and honourable friends. Mr. Speaker, the state of local government finance is desperate. Our councils are not just at breaking point, many of them are broken. And the government's so-called fair funding review could be about to make matters worse for some of those councils. I will give way.
He's making an excellent beginning to his speech. And could I ask him, how many councils like Northamptonshire does he think will fall in the next 5 years? Good point.
Well, of course, that is the worry, because there are a number of local councils that are edging ever closer to the cliff edge. The number that will drop over that cliff edge is very much dependent on the actions of this government. If this government honours their word and puts resources into local communities that need it the most, then hopefully we can avoid more Northamptonshires. Yeah. But if they continue along the lines that I fear they will, by removing resources from those areas that have the greatest need but the least ability to raise their own finances, then I fear for the future of the local government sector. I will give way.
I'm sure my friends had a chance to read the LGRU's excellent annual survey of local government finances. And the point made there that 10% of councils are worried that they won't have sufficient resources to meet their statutory duties. That's a really clear tipping edge we could be at unless the government acts to stop it.
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right on that, and I will touch on that very report later on in my debate, but it really does highlight just what 10 years of cutting our local public services at a time of rising demand, particularly for the expensive people-based services, adult social care and children's services, those impacts that it has had on our local council. Because this is the problem. This is the problem, that with those councils who have the greatest social need, the worst health inequalities, and with a limited tax base to make up for any financial losses, the so-called fair funding formula could be the factor that tips them over the edge. Now, I know that shortly the Minister of State will stand up and pronounce that the recent finance settlement that we are set to agree next Wednesday shows that he is investing in local services. But he's a lone voice in saying this. And it shows just how detached the government is from the sector that they are here supposedly to represent. Because the truth is that since 2015, just 5 years, local government funding across England has fallen by 32%.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Would my honourable friend also agree that local government are also fearful of rumours last week that the Chancellor is asking departments to actually cut another 5% from their budget?
Well, of course, this is very worrying, and we hope that the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government will stand up against this, because, of course, those of us that have been in this House for some time will remember that the former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Lord Pickles, was only too keen to offer up the maximum amount of cuts from his department, meaning that local government in England was clobbered the hardest in any part of the public sector. But it's even worse. I will give way in a second, but it's even worse than the 5 years that I previously stated, that fall of 32%, because since 2010, since the Honourable Gentleman's Party entered government, funding for local councils has been slashed by more than half. And we have all seen the consequences of this neglect. The unrepaired roads, the uncollected bins, the cuts to adult learning, the closed children's centres. Under Conservative leadership, almost a fifth of our libraries have been forced to close because of cuts to funding. And one of the previous Labour government's greatest achievements, in my view, the Sure Start programme, has had its funding slashed in half, forcing as many as 1,000 Sure Start children's centres to close since 2010. I will give way.
Grateful to him giving way. He made the point earlier in his speech where he said that some of the local authorities he was concerned about couldn't raise as much money through council tax. He was worried about the impact on those local authorities. Yeah. Will he accept, though, that's because those shire districts get much less money from local government, and so their council tax has to be much higher? Does he agree it's only right then we do look at a fairer funding formula so everybody pays a fair amount and receives a fair amount?
Very good point. Well, I will come on to the specific points of funding adult social care later on in my contribution, but the fact is this, and I will happily provide these statistics. The 5 most deprived local authorities in England are Liverpool, Knowsley, Blackpool, Kingston upon Hull and Middlesbrough. They have lost over since 2010, over the last decade. Blackpool, 21% of their funding, Knowsley 25% of their funding, Liverpool 23% of their funding, Kingston upon Hull 22% of their funding, Middlesbrough 21% of their funding. A 5% maximum increase in council tax in each of those local authorities raises nothing like the loss of grant funding that they have had. That isn't fair, and the Fair Funding Review, if it is carried out in the way that the Local Government Association are suggesting it might be, will see even greater reductions of funding from these most deprived communities, knowing that they will never ever be able to plug the gap from council tax alone. I'll give way.
They cannot raise it.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and for quite rightly speaking about the cuts to children's centres. But would he also agree with me that when we hear about the rise in knife crime, we have to attribute much of this to the year-on-year cuts to local government finances in terms of youth service provisions, youth justice provisions, but what we should be focusing on is investing in children's provisions and especially in education and work opportunities as well.
Yes, my honourable friend's absolutely right. And again, I've been here long enough to remember the last Labour government introducing something called Total Place. And that meant that all the agencies responsible, the police, the housing associations, the local authority and central government departments worked together to tackle many of these issues in the round. And I think one of the devastating impacts of austerity over the past decade has been the breaking away from that collaboration, from that partnership approach, to a situation where each of those agencies tends to cost shunt. They're making cuts, so it's somebody else's problem, and they push it on to another part of the public sector. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman and then my honourable friend.
Grateful to him for giving way, and he's making some very important points about the situation in England. But you may be aware of the Wales fiscal analysis by the Welsh Government Centre from Cardiff University, which indicates that the cuts in Wales local finance has been about £1 billion over the last 10 years. I know we're dealing with a block grant situation where the block grant is being reduced in real terms, but Labour ministers in Wales have decided to swing the axe at local government.
Well, of course, the block grant, as the honourable gentleman states, is set by this place, and so the Welsh Assembly Government have had to ensure that their spending meets the money that is granted by Westminster. But I have to say this, I've been sent a budget briefing from the Welsh Government about their intentions to not only increase the adult social care budget in the year ahead, but also a real terms increase in local government spending, and that is something that I welcome overwhelmingly, because Welsh councils, like English councils, need good public services.
Durham County Council has lost £224 million in core spending since 2010, and the direction of travel of the government has been to move the expenditure onto council tax precept. The problem that County Durham has is that over 50% of its properties are band A banding. So irrespective of how much you put up the council tax, you're going to do nothing to actually plug the gap that's left by the reduction of core spending.
Yeah, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and you know the fact is that councils can't overnight change their council tax base. If their properties are predominantly band A and band B, that is the council tax base for that local area. And governments of all political persuasions over the years have always recognised that not every council has the same baseline, not every council has the same ability to bring in enough money for basic, decent, statutory public services, and as a consequence, that is why we had in the 1980s the rate support grant, and in the 1990s onwards the revenue support grant, because it recognises that there needs to be a redistribution of funding to those areas that can't generate enough funding from council tax and business rates alone. I'll give way.
Giving way, but can I just gently say to him that not all deprivation is found in urban areas, and places like Cornwall that have had a raw deal of central government funding because of the formula put in place by the party opposite have for decades now received lower levels of funding despite being one of the poorest parts of England, and it is this government with the Fair Funding Review that is going to put that right.
Well, I suspect the honourable gentleman doesn't understand the Fair Funding Review, to be clear, because the fact is I have never said that deprivation only exists in urban areas. Deprivation is a fundamental part of deprivation is a fundamental part of the formula that exists now. So if there is deprivation in the honourable gentleman's constituency, and it's more likely that there is, then his council will get an element of his formula attributed to that deprivation. But to take money from some of the poorest communities in the country to give it to the richest communities in the country with the ability to raise sufficient locally is not one nation. It is not one nation. It is reverse redistribution, and it is penalising the poorest councils and the poorest communities, and the honourable gentleman should reflect on what he has said. I will give way a bit further on because I've been very generous so far, because the point is that by 2025, the Local Government Association, Tory-led, by the way, the Local Government Association estimates that if we continue on this current course, the funding gap will grow to £8 billion. Now, that's an £8 billion gap, not to rebuild our services after 10 years of cuts. That's an £8 billion funding gap just to stay still, just to prevent already heavily stretched services from falling apart under the weight of growing demand, rising costs and wage inflation. I reiterate, £8 billion more needed just to stay the same as we are today. So even if this £8 billion funding was provided in full by 2025, it would barely keep the sector's head above water, allowing councils to continue on delivering services at current levels with no capacity to meet the growing need for services. And it would be interesting to know if the Minister of State considers this is a sustainable way to finance the sector. Because, as my honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee, has already mentioned in an intervention, research published today from the Local Government Information Unit shows that 73% of councils would not agree with him. The chief executive of the LGIU has warned, and I quote, "Our social care system is no longer on the edge, it's fallen off the cliff. Our children's services aren't at breaking point, they're broken." And this has real-life consequences.
Exactly.
In the last 2 years alone, Age UK estimates that 74,000 older people died waiting for care. An average of 81 people a day, equivalent to 3 every hour, died before they received the care they need. This is not a political point. It should shame each and every one of us, on whichever side of this house we sit. Age UK state that 1.4 million older people are not getting the help that they need to carry out essential tasks, such as washing themselves, dressing and going to the toilet. Quite frankly, this is not just unacceptable, it is appalling, and it is a stain on this House, on all of us, and on our country. I will give way.
The Honourable Gentleman is making a very powerful speech. Birmingham City Council, the great city of Birmingham, has been hit hard by the biggest cuts in local government history, £700 million. Children's centres closing, youth clubs closing, social care and special needs provision being cut back. Does the Honourable Gentleman agree with me that it's fundamentally wrong that the vulnerable should be hit in the way that they have been hit so hard, but it is also fundamentally wrong that Birmingham reels from those cuts whilst the leafy shires of Surrey get yet more?
I do agree with my honourable friend, who has been a champion not just of local government across the country, but a champion of that great city of Birmingham and the devastation that has befallen that great city. And on the LGA's own statistics, a further £48 million in adult social care funding could be removed from Birmingham to add to that devastation that's already hit his city. That's why the Fair Funding Review is so unfair and is so wrong. But the point is this. According to the King's Fund, so it's not just the LGIU, by the end of the next decade, the number of older people that need adult social care support is predicted to increase by another 4.1 million. That's piling even more cost pressures on our local councils. And that's why the LGIU also highlights the increase in the financial pressures around children's services, because adult social care is only one part of the very costly equation that is people-based services. The services that councils by law and by right have to provide. But to Mrs Smith, on any street of any town in any shire, thinks that her council tax increases are going towards ever-reducing bin services, the parks not being maintained, the libraries closing, because they never see the impact on adult social care and children's services. And on children's services, the LGIU argues that councils are no longer able to shield vulnerable children from the worst of the budgetary pressures that councils are facing. Over 1 in 3 councils said that their inability to protect vulnerable children was their biggest concern. Now, we know that there is unprecedented demand pressures on children's services. I will give way to the honourable gentleman in a while. The number of children that are in care has hit a 10-year high, but without the funding to support this increase in demand. From 2009 to 2019, the number of Section 47 inquiries, that's where a local authority believes that a child is suffering or is likely to suffer significant harm, has increased by 139%. And the Local Government Association warned that children's services alone are facing a £3.5 billion funding gap by 2025. It is these pressures on the people-based services that's pushing many councils towards the cliff edge, and sticking plasters will no longer suffice. The Minister will no doubt say that he gave £1 billion to be shared by adult social care, children's services and NHS winter pressures. That's not enough. But I will give way, I did promise.
I am very grateful. We have discussed this before, and would he agree that what we should have are cross-party talks on adult social care? The Select Committee, one of the key recommendations was that adult social care funding should be removed entirely from local authority pressures, and we should adopt a German-style social insurance system. Does he agree that we should have cross-party discussions, and that should be one of the options on the table?
Well, of course, it's incumbent, as I've said in previous debates, on the government to come forward with proposals. We're still waiting for the Green Paper that was promised in the last Parliament and the Parliament before that. But look, the fact of the general election is that it's the honourable gentleman's party that is in power, and it's incumbent on ministers to come to this House and to explain how they are going to try and resolve this crisis in adult social care. We will sit down with ministers. We've got our own ideas. We will share ideas with the government. We will come to some kind of consensus if we can. But of course, history on this isn't great. I can remember the Health Secretary at the time, Andy Burnham, having cross-party talks in the dying days of the Labour government, and it looked like we were getting agreement with the Shadow Health Secretary, Andrew Lansley, and the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, all agreeing until that general election came. And then there were posters everywhere. Labour's death tax, Andy Burnham's death tax. We have to move away from that, and we have to tackle this issue seriously. I will give way.
Very grateful to him, very grateful to him. But further to my honourable friend Thursmore's intervention, asking about social insurance, the point is, I intervened on his colleague, the Shadow Health spokesman, a few weeks ago, and I put it to him, would he support social insurance, and he ruled it out flatly. So all we're asking is, if we're going to have cross-party talks, surely all credible options should be on the table.
Well, look, I reiterate what I've just said. It's for the party opposite to come forward with their proposals. We will view those in the round with other ideas. We can see whether we can reach a consensus. But I'm not personally in favour of a system of insurance. I know there are different views on both sides of the House about that issue. I actually think the easiest and quickest way to resolve the social care crisis in local government is to make sure that we fund social care through local government. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to just come on to the issue that could make the situation that I've set out even worse for many of the same local authorities that are already at breaking point, because the research from the Local Government Association has exposed the so-called Fair Funding Review for what it really is. It is a cynical plan that risks leaving more sick and vulnerable people without the care they need. If implemented in the way that the LGA have calculated, and MHCLG apparently told the LGA that their assumptions were along the lines that the Ministry is going, then funding for social care for older people is due to drop in London, the West Midlands, the North East and the North West, whilst the South East and South West will see an increase in many areas. For young adults, the largest decreases will be seen in the North West, the North East, Yorkshire, the East Midlands and West Midlands, while the South East and East of England will see some of the largest increases. And this research from the Tory-led LGA has shown that many of the areas that voted Conservative for the first time in 2019, the so-called red wall seats, areas that put their trust in the government for the first time, will see some of the largest cuts to social care funding if the plans go ahead in the way that have been outlined. Indeed, 3/4 of those red wall constituencies, those seats that gave the Prime Minister his majority, will see millions of pounds of funding diverted from their hard-pressed councils to another part of the country. And the LGA Labour Group estimates that that's £300 million of funding that will be funnelled from less affluent councils to the more affluent communities. But even worse than both of these factors is the effect that it will have on the most deprived communities. Because of the 10 most deprived local authorities in England, they will see, on average, a 13% cut, whilst the wealthiest communities in England will see their budgets grow by 13%. Now, this model was devised back in 2014 at the height of coalition austerity, and perhaps it was then politically expedient for the party opposite to divert funds to leafy Tory shires at the expense of more deprived metropolitan and urban communities. But given that the Prime Minister's claim that austerity is over, divvying up an ever-shrinking pot differently is so last Parliament. In fact, it's so the last 2 parliaments before the last Parliament. And it's certainly no longer politically expedient. So last week I wrote a letter with council leaders to the Red Wall members on the government benches, urging them to speak out against a plan that will see cuts to adult social care, one of the largest cost pressures facing all local councils, particularly those in deprived areas. And I know from some of the responses that members on the other side have given to the press that the calculations from the LGA have been dismissed as speculation. To these members I say this.
Where are they?
This analysis was produced by the cross-party LGA and was released officially to support councils as they plan their budgets in the coming years. The analysis that the LGA produced was also informally shared with MHCLG, whose officials privately confirmed that the assumptions in the analysis are sound. And this new research is also consistent with what we already knew. Last year, researchers in Liverpool warned that removing deprivation from the funding formula would see the 20% most deprived areas lose £390 million a year. And the IFS has also warned that removing deprivation from the formula would likely hit councils in inner London and most other urban areas like Manchester, Birmingham, Newcastle, Bristol, Kingston upon Hull, where deprivation tends to be not just concentrated, but over-concentrated. And they state that, and I quote, "Proposals by the government to base assessments of councils' needs for spending on services like homelessness prevention, public transport, waste collection, libraries and planning on population only would shift funding from councils serving deprived areas to those serving more affluent areas." They've also warned that the evidence base to justify this decision is weak. I'll give way one last time.
I also say to my honourable friend, it's not just about social care. County Durham, under the formula that is proposed, is likely to use £39 million in public health funding, whereas Surrey County Council will actually increase its budget by £14 million. How that can be fair, and I do look forward to my new Conservative colleagues in County Durham arguing how that can be fair to County Durham.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014, so there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon as our First Minister has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.